Hello, this is Calvin Trossel, a Texas AgriLife Extension agronomist in Lubbock, and I welcome you to each other really this morning as we talk about some forage quality issues for Schleilcher and Sutton County. I've known Pasquale for several years. It's been quite a few years actually since we met, and I'm happy to see about contributing to the program here from a distance. A little bit about myself: Kansas farm boy. Not everything that I learned about forages came from the Trossel School of Agriculture, but eventually Kansas State, Texas A&M, some time in Minnesota, and currently I have been in Lubbock 13 years, general cropping agronomist, grain sorghum, summer annual forages, alfalfa, peanuts, a number of other crops that we work with here in the region. Anyway, what I'll do today is I have two presentations prepared, and if things go well, I'll have them both recorded and available. The first is really a little bit more about some forage production pointers. We'll talk about drought just a little bit, and then some very basics of forage quality. The second presentation, depending on which one you see here this morning, would be more about the nutritive value of the forages, a little bit about buying and selling tips. That's especially difficult right now. I can't imagine what it'd be like trying to buy a forage at a distance when you don't have an opportunity to see what you're buying. So anyway, we'll go here, and just again, Calvin Trossel, just some basic forage types here for annual production. Some of this will be more like in sorghum Sudan. We'll talk about small grains just a little bit, and then again, what is one of the most basic quality parameters of forage quality? That's crude protein content. We'll talk about that just a little bit. As far as forage types, annual versus perennial, warm season, cool season, grasses, legumes, there's quite a mix. They all have a purpose. Perennial forages, if we have them established, they're cheaper over the long run to have than perennials because we don't have the annual establishment costs. But there are some quality differences here when we look at some of these grasses, and it really depends to some extent on what type of land you have if you're a producer. But on the other hand, if you're buying forage, then annual versus perennial, warm season versus cool, grasses, legumes, these things likewise have some properties, some traits that we would factor in when we think about buying. Rule of thumb, forage quality. And as my colleague Dr. Larry Redmond would talk about nutritive quality, same principles apply, that as you go from a perennial to an annual forage, you're going to increase forage value, forage quality. As you go from a warm season to a cool season, for example, Bermudagrass to Jose tall wheatgrass, you will increase forage quality. As you go from grasses to legumes, whether that be any of your grasses, Bermudagrass to alfalfa, you will increase forage quality. Forage selection. This is something a lot of times I find that people really don't stop to think about. What kind of animal are you trying to feed? What are you growing for? What are you buying for? When do you need the forage if you're a producer? How much time do you have to take care of pastures and fields? Sometimes our small acreage producers find this is really a little bit more of an effort than they expected, and so that can be a problem. Maintenance cost, irrigation if it's even available, excuse me, sometimes is an issue, and that can govern what you might decide to do about forage if you're producing. The bottom line on forage, what is your goal? And that again I think really comes back to whether you're buying or selling forage, whether you're producing as well. Those kinds of things are going to factor into what we try to accomplish on the farm as a producer or as a feeder or as a seller. Some of the things with forage selection, and this comes back a little bit more towards what we have involved if you're a producer. You've got forages that have been grown in your area that are adapted. I know Pasquale said that Sutton County really only has 3 or 4 people that grow very much forage. Sometimes we pick up a farm magazine or hear something on the radio talks about some wonder forage, and I'm always a little skeptical of the miracle forages that just seem to promise everything, like you can graze so many cattle or animal performance will be such and such. I think we know enough about forages in Texas that we can let someone else develop the learning curve for new forages and find out what the potential issues might be with those forages. And grew up in Kansas. Doesn't matter. We've heard this said often about Missouri. Missouri, the show me state, and so likewise reminded, if it sounds too good to be true, then it probably is, and that's something to keep in mind when we're dealing with forages. Forage selection, some of the pitfalls that kind of come into production. We don't want to be greedy. We don't want to have unrealistic expectations. If you have a forage that really performs average for about 10 years or so, that's actually probably a pretty decent forage. It's perennial in nature, costs are down, and especially sometimes when we go into small acreage production systems, and we see this around a larger city like Lubbock or San Angelo or San Antonio. You get people that expect to graze 5 horses on 3 acres, and they'll have plenty of forage, and it just doesn't work. What they ended up out there basically is almost like a concrete pad, and so those are some of the things to keep our real expectations in check. Growing for quality forage. If you're feeding forage, if you're selling, what type of animals are you looking at? It's especially a lot of folks do not stop to think carefully about cows versus stockers. We'll talk about wheat hay in a little bit. If you have the boot stage quality wheat hay, very high quality, I'll show you some numbers about protein. You may be looking at 16-17% crude protein. Is that the kind of forage you'd want to send into cows? Probably not. They'll not take advantage of it. In a sense, you're throwing some money away. But on the other hand, if you've got low quality forage, sometimes our animal scientists tell us, and feed specialists agree, is that it often costs more to feed poor quality forage. The supplement costs are there. Sometimes people are not thinking about that. We get poor quality forage, we wonder how come our stockers aren't gaining 2 pounds or more per day. Well, there's a reason. They don't have enough protein. They don't have enough energy. If you're selling hay, and sometimes this is an issue that comes up, you're selling hay, if you have a buyer that appreciates and understands forage quality, then and is willing to pay for it, then sell him what he wants. If they don't understand these things, then don't waste your effort and your high quality forage selling to someone who's just looking for filler hay. In that case, just sell them pounds, because that's really what they're looking at. Harvest stage, if you're in control of that, or if you're looking at buying forage, looking at stage of growth is very important, because that's possibly your first indicator of what type of forage quality you might be looking at. Growing for quality forage. Grazing and baling. Energy level decreases with maturity. A TDN, that's total digestible nutrients. In a lot of hays, sorghum Sudan would be a good example. At or just before boot stage is where you really have very good TDN. You're still getting good yield quality, a combination of yield and quality there. But keep in mind, the more mature a forage is, that all those forage values, TDN is listed on this slide, but it could be crude protein. We could talk about the fiber measures, the energy per pound or per ton, however you want to look at it. That quality is going to decrease as that forage becomes more mature. In the case here listed on the slide in red would be where sorghum Sudan begins to head out. Annual forages. We'll talk about warm seasons first and come back to a few comments about cool season small grains. But usually the summer annual forages here in Texas that we spend the most time talking about primarily are in the sorghum Sudans. Hybrid pearl millet a little bit. We'll mention a few basics there because there are some distinctives, and that's important among other matters if you're a horse owner in terms of how hybrid pearl millet can fit into a farming operation if you're a producer. So here we are, sorghum Sudan, Haygrazer. On your lower left we've got one forage that's headed out. We have another one to the right which actually is a photoperiod sensitive sorghum Sudan. A little bit taller, probably more yield there. But when we see a headed out forage like we have in the lower left hand corner there, that just tells me right away that you're looking at something that's going to have a little bit lower quality forage. I was growing up on a farm in Kansas. We had Haygrazer in some of our little feedlots during the summer, and it would head out. We never cut it early, and so in my mind at that time I think, well, we have this grain that's in the head here. Isn't grain good? Well, yes, it is, but unless you grind it up, it's going to pass through the rumen, and you don't get any feed value out of it. So, likewise, some of the other issues here with sorghum Sudans. Warm season annual. One of the things about the Sudan, what it brings to sorghum family forages, is that it causes the forage to retiller. So sorghum Sudans are especially a good fit if you're looking at a grazing situation or if you're looking at haying and then coming back and getting regrowth. And of course, we're in a drought situation. We'd love to have any growth right now, let alone think about regrowth, but this is certainly why sorghum Sudans have a lot of value. In contrast, there are forage sorghums in Texas. Those are more for large one-time hay harvest, most likely silage, and they do not regrow back very well. So, a couple of things about Haygrazers. You get the crosses with the Sorghum. We'll also have sorghum Sudans, but anyway, with sorghum Sudans, the higher yielding than just your straight Sudangrass, which looks a little bit more like Johnson grass than anything else that you're probably familiar with. Sorghum Sudan tends to have a little less than 50% leaf, coarser stems, but again, the Sudangrass in there, when it's added to sorghum, gives a real good regrowth and tillering potential, and that is how a lot of the hay that we're looking at buying, especially when we need to bring hay in, may be, as we're looking at Haygrazers. Sorghum Sudan hybrids, if you're buying, there's differences in the season of maturities. There's lots of varieties. Actually, they're hybrids. Sometimes we have the old three-way crosses. That's the common name that you'll find in Texas. That's a sweet sorghum or a sorghum Sudan cross. And one thing about marketing, a lot of times when we come in with all the different hybrids that you can buy, you'll find brand names like Sweeter Than Honey and Sugar Graze and all these really nice sounding terms. And folks, that's really marketing. The cattle, they may be able to tell a little difference, but that sweet sorghum name or whatever they put on it is really more about marketing to you and I as potential buyers of seed than anything else. I'll make one note here about hybrid pearl millets. We see hybrid pearl millets in some parts of Texas, in the high plains, for example. They tend to be more leafy than sorghum Sudans. They're very drought tolerant, but they have very small seed, and so they cannot be planted as deeply as sorghum Sudans. So sometimes, unless you have irrigation, that is an emergence issue. Forage production tends to be a little bit less on good soils when rainfall is not limiting, but in drought situation we would see hybrid pearl millets probably yield comparable to what we get with sorghum Sudans. Need a little bit warmer temperatures for soil, for germination, very drought tolerant, a little bit more sensitive than sorghum Sudan would be to overgrazing, and so for haying, or if we're grazing, we like to ensure that we don't take all the stubble off the field. A couple of characteristics about hybrid pearl millets here. I'll actually go to the bottom here. Hybrid pearl millet is not a member of the sorghum family, and so millet is okay, acceptable hay for horses. In fact, there are some horse owners who like to have millet, and we'll seek that out. Another thing that's distinctive about hybrid pearl millet, because again it is not a member of the sorghum family, in red, no prussic acid problems. That is, prussic acid, which is cyanide by another name, is not something that is ever developed in hybrid pearl millets. That prussic acid problem essentially is only an issue with any forage that's in the sorghum family. Sometimes we see some caliche soils, high pH soils, we have a little trouble with iron deficiency in sorghum Sudans. The sorghum family hybrids are poor when it comes to getting good iron nutrition, iron uptake, and so sometimes we have some growth issues there if we have high pH. This is a picture actually out of Scurry County. We've had sorghum Sudan that's been swathed, waiting harvest here. But what is interesting to me is you see all the regrowth that's going on here with the stubble. If you look up and down these rows as we come here, we're looking in many cases 3 or 4 tillers per plant. We've got a crop here that's been cut with about 4 or 5 inches worth of stubble left. That helps drive the regrowth process. Sometimes on dry land, producers will say, however, well, I don't know if it's going to rain again, so I'm just going to cut it as close to the ground and get every last pound I can out of that field. And later in the season, that certainly is more viable where you expect to have less growth. But obviously, from experience and research, it is certainly shown that leaving a little bit of stubble there can help drive some regrowth. Now, a couple of things I'll introduce here, and after about 10 years or more, I refer to these as still the new Summer Annual Forage Types in West Texas. It started in the Texas High Plains. I go to county meetings or talk to producers, not just in the High Plains, that are still not really familiar with what BMR, or brown midrib, sorghum Sudans forage sorghums are. There's also BMR hybrid pearl millets now. We're going to skip the photoperiod sensitive forages here, but let's come back to the BMR forages, because I think this is something, whether you're a producer or if you're buying hay, has some merit for consideration. There's a couple of things here. On the left you see the leafiness. I'm going to show you with some arrows here. These don't show up in the screens. There we go. You see the brown midrib. Now what this is really not anything that's particularly distinct in terms of what the color itself actually means, but this is just a trait and why we call these hybrids brown midribs. What is distinct about these brown midrib traits in sorghum Sudan forages is primarily the lignin content of stems is reduced by sometimes as much as 50%. Now lignin, how does lignin compare in forages? Your cattle have 4 stomachs. They have rumen. They can digest to some extent. They can get a little bit of feed value and a little bit of energy from cellulose and hemicellulose. Lignin is very indigestible. It's bulk material that passes through the gut. Really about the only thing that will digest lignin is termites, and that's not good. So what we have here is if you can reduce the lignin content in a forage, then we should have higher digestibility. And most of the research in Texas has shown that brown midrib forages tend to be several percent higher in total digestible nutrients. And one other thing that I might mention is sometimes brown midrib forages don't yield quite as much as the conventionals. That's a general statement, maybe 5, more likely 10% less in yield. But a number of producers that tell me that they have fed brown midrib forages, especially in a grazing situation, have said they feel like it's a value, and if the price is right, they're certainly interested in having BMR forages. So here's the cattle, and we talk about lower lignin content in brown midrib sorghum Sudans. Just a couple of pictures here to give us an idea of what we're talking about. One of the things that's been highlighted with brown midrib or BMR forages is that we can sometimes see selective grazing preference from cattle. This is a picture that came out of Deaf Smith County and shared by a seed company, and the next picture that I'll show you was taken 10 days later. We've got a conventional sorghum Sudan in the back. We have a brown midrib forage sorghum here in the front, and after 10 days, what do the cattle think? What you can see here is the cattle specifically have grazed the BMR forage. Now, what we see happen typically when cattle go into BMR forages, this is not always the case, but frequently we've seen this. Producers have told me about it. We've had some demonstrations that Extension has ran as far southeast as Scurry County around Snyder. It takes a few days. The cattle begin to feel or begin to sense that there's something different about a BMR forage, and they'll begin to graze on it preferentially. Sometimes I've even seen cattle graze on the stalks with BMR when they still have a little bit of leafy material still remaining on conventional forages. BMR cost to seed. Well, you might think that if a forage is going to be better, okay, then maybe it's going to cost a little bit more, and that tends to be the case. Conventional sorghum Sudans for good brands, for good hybrids, will run around $30 a bag. You can still buy some sorghum Sudans 3-way crosses. Many companies will have their cheap sorghum Sudan that may be $16, $18, maybe $20 a bag. Most of the brown midrib sorghum Sudans tend to run about $50 a bag, but certainly it's something worth thinking about. I encourage producers more than anything is to try a bag, especially if you're grazing, because I think there might be something. If you can get a BMR bag from a couple of different companies, mark your field if you're drilling and just see if your cattle can tell you in a grazing situation what you have. Likewise, if I'm buying sorghum Sudan, I would ask if the sorghum Sudan is brown midrib. That tells me that lignin content's a little bit lower. It doesn't mean that that is a better forage than the next person might have down the road or that you talk to, but brown midrib tends to be a little bit more valuable as far as feed value. Now here are 2 slides. This is the first, and something that I emphasize in a lot of my programs with several different forages. It could be alfalfa, it could be the wheat hay, which I'll show you here in a few minutes. This is for sorghum Sudangrass, and we're looking at stage of growth on the left, beginning with early vegetative growth, through boot stage, heading bloom, on to dough. Like I mentioned earlier, dough stage, when I was a kid growing up, well, that's grain. Isn't grain good? Grain's got energy in it. Let's go back up the list here a little bit to the boot stage. And typically with sorghum Sudan, over a number of years. The usually boot stage, depending on your preference, early boot to late boot is kind of a happy medium for forage quality with sorghum Sudan when you're looking at forage quality versus tonnage, because obviously the longer you let this grow, the more tonnage you're going to have. But we look in here and we can see with early vegetative stage, this would be something that's probably in the range of maybe 3 foot tall. If it's dry land, it may be a little bit shorter than that. Boot stage for Schleilcher and Sutton County in a typical year might be around 4 feet tall, and a wet year could be 5 or 6 feet tall. To get an idea for what we're looking at here in terms of the forage. And in this particular example here, boot stage, we're looking at 13.6% crude protein. You see how it's higher for earlier vegetative stages, and then how that number continues to go down. And the thing here, when we talked earlier about what kind of animal am I looking at feeding to? If you take some of this bloom stage and you get into dough stage where you've got grain development here and you're feeding that to stockers and you're wondering how come they're not gaining very well, well, there's part of your story. They are not getting enough protein. They have to be supplemented. Likewise, this hay down here at the bottom of the list may be quite appropriate if you've got dry mama cows that are just waiting. Certainly for cows, that's more viable. On the other hand, when you've got higher quality forage, you could waste that going into an animal that doesn't need the protein or the energy. Similar slide, another data set just to reinforce with sorghum Sudan what kind of forage qualities we're looking at. We've got mid-boot here. This one here we have wet tons per acre, so normally the wet tonnage is about 2/3 of the total biomass on a wet ton basis. So crude protein at 15% mid-boot stage, and we see again, like the preceding example, how that crude protein has fallen below 9%. Even though our tonnage has increased here by about 80%, the crude protein level has fallen by about that's about 40% decrease in crude protein levels. Now I'll make a quick comment here. Sometimes this is brought up often in relation to sorghum Sudans. We'll talk about prussic acid here in a moment, but this particular slide is on nitrates. Warm season annual grasses, sorghum Sudans, those kinds of things, Sudans, millets, can be in corn. A lot of times with annual grasses, they've been fertilized with nitrate. If they're not growing very well, we can have nitrate accumulation in the forage. Something else that we know is there are some particular types of weed species. Pigweed, especially, is a notorious accumulator of nitrate. And how we sometimes see nitrate accumulation in a lot of forages is we have dry weather, it's dry enough in fact that growth may be stopped, and in spite of the lack of growth, plants continue to take up nitrate because there's a little bit in the moisture that the plants are transpiring. They accumulate nitrate in the base of the plant, and then that can become a feeding issue. Johnson grass is another potential accumulator of nitrate. One thing that we know is once nitrate is in the forage, whether we if we are taking nitrate for hay, then we are locking in nitrate. It will not decrease with time. Older plants usually don't have as much nitrate. They've diluted the nitrate, if you will, and if we suspect that we have a nitrate issue, then and we're swathing, then we could raise the cutter bar a couple of inches and leave more of that nitrate in the field, which if it's sorghum Sudan and you're looking for regrowth, then that would not necessarily be considered a loss. Folks that deal with nitrate in forages that are going to be ensiled, usually that will decrease the nitrate levels in time. What about nitrogen levels as far as nitrates in forages? Important question, especially with the kind of drought that we've had across Texas here in 2011. We've seen a higher than normal number of forage samples come back from both the public lab at Texas A&M as well as private labs, at least the ones I'm familiar with in High Plains, where nitrate levels have been elevated. There is some disagreement among researchers and educators in terms of what potential parts per million nitrate is toxic for cattle. 10 part per million would be the same as 1% nitrate in the forage. And sometimes your forage tests will report nitrate, nitrogen, and nitrate, and what we're reporting here is the nitrate level, not the nitrate nitrogen level, which would be a lower number. But keep in mind if you're looking at a forage test which number they're reporting, because there is a difference. Nitrate levels in cattle, basically, if you have animals that are exposed slowly to nitrate levels, they can build up a little bit of well, I choose my word carefully here, a little bit of tolerance to nitrates, higher nitrate levels in forage, but this again is just the general level there. Certainly we make a distinction. If you've got pregnant cows, then that is something that's a little bit more of a concern. If anything, if there's any question about nitrates, it can be tested. Fairly simple test, much simpler than the prussic acid test. I know some of our forages, people recommend that you get a nitrate test no matter what, but certainly we usually can try to narrow that down in terms of what we need to test for and what we don't. Now a little bit about prussic acid, and this is appropriate here in this discussion because we've talked about sorghum Sudans, and as I mentioned earlier, if you have a sorghum forage, any forage that's in the sorghum family is susceptible to prussic acid. Two situations when this normally occurs. One is when you get a first frost and freeze across the region when you have growing crop. In that case, we need to pull the cattle off for about a minimum of 1 week to let the cyanide, the prussic acid, dissipate out of the plants. The other situation is when we have particularly a drought-stressed crop, the sorghum Sudan crop in the summer. It's drought-stressed, it's not growing very well, it gets a good rain, and then we get a flush of growth for the next week or so, especially around the base of the plant, some new tillering. That forage, new growth there, tends to be very hot for prussic acid because it's new and it's tender. That's what the cattle in a grazing situation prefer to eat. So again, that's a situation where we need to pull cattle off. Hay is normally safe from prussic acid. That is, in the time that it takes to properly cure hay down to dryness for your less than 20% moisture, for 18% moisture less to bale, then prussic acid normally will dissipate. Finally, again, as we noted earlier, hybrid pearl millet does not produce prussic acid, does not need to be tested for prussic acid. Forage testing for prussic acid. This is a tricky situation, and what I've seen since I've been here in Lubbock for Texas AgriLife over the last 10 years or so, there's been some changes in how we approach prussic acid. We used to report that if we had prussic acid levels below a certain level, then we probably would just say that, if it's below a certain level, it's okay to feed. And there was a discrepancies in the literature in terms of what that value actually was. It usually was more in terms of 600 parts per million, which is dry matter basis. If it's wet forage, then forage being usually about 2/3 moisture when it's cut, then prussic acid needed to be below 200 parts per million. If you have forage with prussic acid in it, then that means that probably it's not being cured properly. Or if you're in a grazing situation, you just need to back the cattle out for a little bit. Now the tendency going forward is more towards the erring on the side of safety, and that is if you have a forage test and it shows the presence, not necessarily a given level or concentration of prussic acid, but if it shows the presence of prussic acid, the general advice is to go ahead and back off the forage for immediate feeding. So sampling for prussic acid is very tricky. What I do in the Lubbock region is we recommend that people collect their samples late in the afternoon. They can FedEx them overnight. We like the Servitec lab in Amarillo. They're set up to do prussic acid tests, but it's very tricky, and certainly the result that comes from a test is certainly subject to how the sample was collected, whether it was dry, and normally in that case I usually recommend that producers that I deal with more directly just call the Servitec lab, or actually I would say probably more specific, the Texas Veterinary Medical Diagnostic Lab in Amarillo. I said Servitec earlier, that's for nitrate testing, but Texas Veterinary Medical Diagnostic Lab is particularly accustomed to testing for prussic acid, and because of the uncertainty in how samples are collected, that's why we often say that if samples show the presence of prussic acid, then we need to back off of feeding and allowing grazing on the livestock. I'll switch here a little bit. Pasquale, you had mentioned about a little bit of small grains for hay, particularly up in Schleilcher County. Same questions come up. Are you selling small grains for hay? If your buyer understands small grains forage quality, then that maybe is something that you can work to your advantage in terms of providing what they need. If you're buying, same principles apply, and basically the first rule of thumb here would be that if you have forage, which is the more mature it is, the lower quality it's going to be. We don't want to waste high quality small grains hay on cows that don't need it or expect stockers to gain 2 pounds when they're grazing on headed out beardless wheat. Just a couple of thoughts here. One is we look for leafiness in small grains forage. Here's VNS, or variety not stated, beardless wheat from the Lubbock area, and grazing here on your lower left. The one thing I could say is with wheat varieties in terms of forage production, when I started with some testing about 11 years ago on small grains varieties in the high plains, I expected that we would find forages and wheat grain or wheat varieties, whether they would be bearded wheats that could be harvested still in the boot stage and be okay for hay, or the beardless wheats, that we would find varieties in there that would be a top choice for forage production. But the bottom line was we really didn't find any major differences in the forage production among all the different wheat varieties. Beardless wheats do not produce more forage than bearded wheats, and that was a surprise because people here talked about beardless wheats as almost as if beardless wheat was manna from the good Lord for your livestock. And the funny thing about the beardless wheats to me is I grew up in Kansas. You know, some people call Kansas the wheat state, and I'm a K-State agronomy major, and I'd never heard of beardless wheat until I'd come to the Texas High Plains. And so certainly it's something that seems to be a little bit more emphasized here. Small grains, wheat for forage, beardless hay, beardless wheat if you're going to hay. Again, this is not an issue if you have bearded wheat and you're going to cut in boot stage, but obviously if you've got bearded wheat, it has to be cut at boot stage, grazed preferentially before it begins to head out. Otherwise we have an issue with the awns in terms of grazing. Some common varieties that you might find down in the Schleilcher-Sutton area: Weathermaster 135, Abilene Ag Supply, has been around for a number of years. Longhorn is an old AgriPro variety. Tam 401 is a newer Texas A&M release that's a beardless wheat. Again, testing has really not shown any major differences in some of these varieties. Otherwise, if you're not necessarily needing beardless wheat, then whatever wheats grow well in your area. Coronado might be an example because of some Hessian fly areas to the north over towards San Angelo. Tam 112 is well adapted across much of Texas. Certainly a choice. Small grains, in a rain-fed situation, we don't always have control of when we would like to plant, but as I could project into Schleilcher and Sutton County, if I'm looking to graze small grains, sometime somewhere around mid-September would appear to me. And Pasquale, Anthony, correct me as needed for your folks in attendance. Mid-September, a target for planting, knowing that if we go too much earlier, then we're really burning up a lot of moisture that we could use more efficiently later in the season, that could produce us more forage later in the season if we don't plant too early. Okay, small grains, a couple other choices here. Oats. What I think oats really have, we have oat grain production in parts of the state, but oats also can provide forages, and especially in a supplemental situation when we don't have the forage that we need, we can come in late in winter time. Not spring oats, but really late winter oats, and again for Schleilcher-Sutton, sometime around February 1st would appear to me, again from a distance, to be a time where oats could be planted. We prefer to go for forage production with your longer maturity varieties, and so depending on whether any of these names like Troy or Monida or Magnum would be available, they might be a better forage choice. Rye is cold tolerant. Probably the further south and east we go in Texas, the less of a concern that would be. Sometimes rye is very spindly when we get towards the end of the season and doesn't really produce as much forage, but it certainly tends to have a little bit more hardiness in terms of maybe its winter survivability. This is a slide from Lubbock, and it is very much a proxy for what we have on forage quality on small grains. This particular is oats, but again, like we showed with the sorghum Sudans, some differences here on growth stage. And so on the left in the light blue you see the different growth stages. These were cut every 7 days here at Lubbock. our middle column, we see dry hay yields going from about 1.6 tons, 3,200 pounds, up past 3 tons per acre. And then here you see the crude protein. We start at 18.4%, that begins to drop, and we end up below 9% when we hit firm dough. And perhaps not necessarily the best way to do this, but to calculate pounds of crude protein per acre, and we actually see a peak in that. So anyway, again, in terms of heading here, there's no beardless issue with oats. They can be harvested at any time. We don't have the awns like we do in wheat. But what we find, again, is that all-important crude protein question is a proxy for the most basic parameter of forage quality and what kind of tons per acre we have. And if you're haying, then this is, again, you're going to ask a question of who's my buyer if I'm feeding this myself? Where do I need to be? What kind of hay do I need to have for the animals that I'm looking at feeding? Small grains grazing. In a dry year, if we get any forage at all right now, it's very difficult to not grub it down too short. That's really the case with small grains grazing. Is when it's dry like this, like we see in the high plains right now, we do have a little bit of wheat around. The thing is less grazing now could mean more grazing in the long run if we allow those plants to not be grubbed down completely so that they can maintain a little bit of leaf area, take advantage of some rains, and expand their root system as time would allow. Baling quality, bales per acre, it goes down. You're about 18 to 20% protein, and again, when those plants head out, or maybe a little bit, maybe towards 16%. But again, when we get grain and small grains, then we're going to see that protein drop below 10%. Now, Bermudagrass, and Pasquale, Anthony, you may want to pitch in here a little bit more on Bermudas. I have some Bermuda experience, and certainly most of what we see in the high plains is irrigated. A couple of things that we do know about Bermudas in general in Texas: sprig varieties tend to yield a little bit more than seeded varieties, but there's a lot more cost involved there at establishment. Two reasons why sprig varieties might yield a little bit more. Well, I'll say 3 reasons. One, the first really is the fact that there's more breeding and more selection going into sprig varieties than there are with seeded varieties, and so we've got more effort to try to improve the Bermudas. Seed production, in most sprig varieties, in many cases they're hybrids. They do not produce seed or very little seed, so that energy that goes into seed otherwise goes into forage. And then there certainly is indication that sprig varieties, maybe a little more vigorous, have a slightly different, deeper root system. What we do know, very important consideration for much of Texas, and we don't appreciate this as much in the high plains because coastal Bermudagrass, the old coastal variety, is not existent in the high plains. It's not cold tolerant enough. Tifton 85 has hung on here around the edges. But in central Texas, Tifton 85 has replaced a lot of coastal types because the Tifton 85 is certainly more digestible, particularly for younger animals, and there's some reasons for that in terms of the chemistry of how the cellulose and the lignin is related and linked to each other, and that link is much weaker in T85. And from what I understand from forage specialists like Dr. Larry Redmond in College Station, is that the Tifton 85 is especially advantageous when it comes to feeding younger animals. So that's a good question. If you're buying Bermudagrass, what variety is it? Because if it's Tifton 85, it may have a little bit more value as far as feeding, particularly for younger animals. The other thought here about Bermudagrass: too hungry and too thirsty. And that has been the title of some of my programs when I look at Bermudagrass, because without high rainfall, Bermudagrass is extensive to grow, and there's a lot of folks that just have said to me that they never realized how much they really needed to fertilize Bermudagrass. It is certainly very hungry, and some people decide that I don't like spending so much money on fertilizer and decide to choose some other grasses instead. Bermudagrass for forage, and there's a lot of seeded varieties. Sometimes, depending on where you are in the state, you'll find blends, and I don't think that there's really all that much difference among blends. I would defer to folks in the local area in terms of what may work best. As far as the persistence of Bermudagrass, stands are strong for 15 years. Even in the presence of cold in the high plains, we can see Bermuda persist for a long time. Extension does have information if you're interested on Bermudagrass and some of the principles. That information is dated. It's from about 1988. but that's not right, 1998, but it still has a lot of relevant information is available for download or through your ag agent office. Okay, a few final comments here in this segment. Storage losses, just a couple of pictures here. You know, the dumb things that we can do with forage. When we go through all the effort of baling forage at the right stage of growth, we picked varieties, we fertilized, we managed it well, we've got it in a bale, and then we look at water damage through a bunch of hay here, stored directly on bare soil. Here in your lower right hand is 2 bales, and over time one's on a rock platform that you can see here at the bottom, the other is stored over on grass, and with the decomposition and the rotting of the hay underneath, you begin to see that we're losing forage. So dumb things that we do, you know, poor storage or lack of storage. How many times do I go up and down our roads and I see some hay that's just sitting out there on bare ground? Maybe the bales have been pushed up tight against each other, but the worst thing is they should have just sold the stuff. Maybe they were waiting for a price that they had a pie-in-the-sky idea about what their forage was worth, and now it's worth a lot less because it's still there and it's rotted a lot. Forage quality. Feeding loose hay on the ground, that's one of the things that, you know, we like to avoid if we can. Feed bunks, hay racks, those kinds of things keep forage from being tromped as well. It keeps it in one place because once it falls on the ground, it may get tromped into moisture, to mud if we have it. The cattle like to lay on it. When we look at forages, we're baling forages, and if we've got alfalfa, a little alfalfa around St. Angelo, you may see a tractor running out there in the hayfield at night baling alfalfa. That's because they've got to try to keep that leaf on the legume, because otherwise the forage value is lost. Barns, sheds, tarpaulins, they all can do very much to preserve significant forage value, and if you have them, they're certainly worth using. Stored hay for several years can maintain the bulk of its forage value in stark contrast to what we have if we're fed outside. We talked about feeding loose hay on the ground, and I see this here in Lubbock. We see cattle, they are so grateful when producers come out and feed them hay and they can lay on it. They love that. But if it's wet, it gets tromped in, or it's a little dry spot where they can claim. So we end up with losing maybe 20% of our forage value, maybe even more, simply because the forage is on the ground, it's getting tromped in. Big round bale racks, those are one things. Some people have them, some may not. But that restricts the tromping and the hay being spread out on the ground, and is able to kind of regulate the feeding at a certain rate, and it keeps the waste from being nearly as high. Feed bunks, you know, that's another thing. Feed bunks sometimes, you know, the farm I grew up on, my dad gripes about having to maintain feed bunks and so forth, but we certainly knew that they had their value, because with the rainier, wetter conditions in Kansas during the winter time and fall, we certainly had to keep our feed where the cattle could get to it and not endure the waste that we might otherwise have. Savvy buyers. Now, a few things here, and I can empathize with our group this morning in terms of what you're dealing with right now, trying to buy good quality hay, trying to buy any hay for that matter. But to some of the things that if we get a chance, we're looking for weeds in hay. That's a tip-off, lower quality. Ask for a forage analysis or take your own. And just a comment here that sometimes this is a sticky situation. If you have somebody that has hay for sale, you'd like to buy it, can I take a forage sample? If they tell you no, then unless I'm really desperate, I'm just going to try to find somebody else to buy hay from, because if they're telling you no, then there's probably something they might be trying to hide from you. And you know, what's the intent of that? It's trying to take you for a little bit of a ride there in terms of forage quality that might not exist. Looking for maturity of the hay that you buy. Is it headed out? If it's sorghum Sudan and it's headed out, then start thinking maybe 11 or 12%. If it's got grain development in the head, if you find seeds in the head that are firm, then you're looking at sub 10% forage quality. But on the other hand, if it's boot stage, then you know that you've got a little bit more potential for forage quality there. For sorghum Sudans, BMR forage may be a little bit higher in value. It may sell for a little bit more. And likewise, if it was Bermudagrass hay that you're looking at, if it's Tifton 85 and you got younger animals, it may be worth just a little bit more. Forage tests can show some of these kinds of things. Certainly, if you can keep forage tests over a period of years with the hay that you buy, then you have a little bit more of a background in terms of what's normal, what kind of conditions the hay was produced under, and how it may feed for you. Price and storage method. You know, hay that's wrapped in big round bales, it's going to be worth a little bit more versus string hay. If the hay's been stored under a shed, then maybe I'll go ahead and pay that what they're asking price wise. If it's been stored outside, I may say, look, I'm going to have to back off a little bit on this. Something here that is a little bit of a dilemma, and I sympathize with trying to figure out how to do this. Price per bale or price per ton. A lot of hay here in Texas, I would say, is probably sold based on bales, especially for big rounds. But you can have bales that are maybe 800 pounds on one end to possibly twice as much on the other. And not all bales that are the same size are the same. Depends on the tractor driver and types of baler, whether it was packed tight and so forth. And so that's an issue there. And so I certainly encourage people, if you're looking at hay, you're looking to buy, that running hay across a set of scales is one good way to help keep people honest, to ensure that at least you're getting what you are paying for. Okay, now in the situation here for drought in Texas 2011, as we move into winter and into 2012, you're buying hay at a distance. And again, I'm not sure that I have the best word here on how to do this. You've got, hopefully you have people that you've bought from that still have hay. I know the distance could be very problematic. Even my brother in Kansas says US Highway 75, which comes to Dallas, and there's some days it looks like a hay pipeline. And so people have had to buy hay. Maybe they've had a chance to look at it or gone through a hay broker, whatever the case would be. Regardless, ask the same questions as if you were standing there on the turn row or at the haystack in terms of stage of growth and all those kinds of things that are going to govern what kind of hay quality you're looking at. Ask for that forage analysis. Better yet, if you can collect it yourself, that's what we'd love to do. A Penn State hay sampler or a Colorado State hay sampler, these are kinds of things that are fairly inexpensive, that certainly could pay for themselves in an instant if it stops you from paying an inflated price for hay that doesn't have the quality, or helps you determine what you're looking at. Prices, your ag agents should have maybe some ideas on what relative hay prices are running. What I have listed here in this URL is a USDA hay market report that comes out of Amarillo on Fridays. It does have information for all of Texas, primarily the high plains, but likewise they will give hay prices downstate, and maybe gives you at least an idea of what some of the price ranges are. Your hay seller reputation, and then the other thing that I dread to think about is how you go about paying for hay at a distance when you may not have even seen it. And that's a concern of me, and I don't really have an answer for that, but I trust that folks have figured out how to handle that. We've had instances here in Texas where producers have sold hay and have never gotten payment, and then it goes the other way. You buy hay, and what was delivered at the farm certainly wasn't worth what you paid for it. Savvy consumers, whether you're a stockman or whether you're the animal itself, certainly want good quality hay. And what I hope we've delivered here is just a few tips and some things about sorghum Sudan and some of the hay quality parameters that we've talked about. If you have any questions about these, I'm always available by phone. Contact Anthony or Pasquale, and we certainly would be happy to hop on the phone and visit.